Donald Trump's return and Justin Trudeau's looming exit have shaken up Canadian politics, and it's all leading to some movement in the polls. The latest data from Leger suggests the Liberals are rebounding in Quebec, gaining 7 points to get back into a first-place tie with the Bloc after falling all the way back to third. Leger's data also suggests the Liberals could jump to 38% if Mark Carney was the leader. Now, ECOS has reported the most dramatic shifts, putting the Liberals nationally just 3 points behind the Conservatives. That's a surge not seen anywhere else. Last month, Abacus data still had the Conservatives ahead of the Liberals nationally by 21 points. Leger has it at 18, Nanos at 16. And today, Ipsos has the Conservatives' lead at just 13 points nationally. So, that result is in line with a recent poll from the Angus Reid Institute, where the survey says the Conservative lead could shrink to just 14 points if Mark Carney was the Liberal leader. It all still points to a solid Conservative win, but does this movement suggest that lead isn't solid? We'll start there with the Power Panel. Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Gary Keller is a former chief of staff to Conservative cabinet ministers. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. We ended our numbers with her polls, so we're going to start with her. So Shachi, look, still a decisive Conservative lead here, but there's a lot of fluctuation. They were up by about 25, 26, 27 at one point. What do we take from all of this volatility?
So watch really, really carefully what is happening with the Conservative vote and what is happening to the NDP's vote vis-a-vis this Liberal surge. And I think all of the polls now, depending on where they land, are fairly aligned in indicating, if nothing else, that there is some renewed interest, some second looks, if you will, at the Liberal Party under a new leader. We prompted respondents over the possibility of the two frontrunners, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. It does feel, because Liberal members are not necessarily representative of all demographics of the country, but it feels like things are maybe coalescing a little bit around Mark Carney in terms of his chances, but I wouldn't pronounce on that. But what I would tell you is, from a popular opinion perspective, from a polling perspective, the prospect of him as leader certainly has, and for Freeland too, but less so, a lot of people looking twice. But what's really important here is, who are those second lookers? Who is taking another look at the Liberal Party? And our data shows that the Conservative vote, with the party led by Pierre Poilievre rolling into a future election, has actually remained fairly rock solid. Maybe they've lost a couple points, but they're holding their vote. Where most of this renewed support is coming from are NDP voters who are stampeding over to the Liberals. And so this is actually very bad news if you're Jagmeet Singh in the NDP. Of course, this is good news if you're the Liberals, but a couple of caveats. What I can tell you, going back to 2015, is that the left of center vote in this country tends to be a mile wide and an inch deep, and it's always a matter of where is it going to settle. And if you start to see the Liberal vote starting to coalesce on the strength of defecting NDP voters, it really does represent an anybody but Conservative, an ABC or an ABP movement, more than necessarily a real love-in for the Liberals. But let's see. He's picking up momentum.
It's interesting, though, Cameron, that the NDP would be losing support to a former central banker, which is an interesting Venn diagram. I'm going to need to see someone break down for me. But, you know, in terms of the Liberal Party, the numbers have shifted from extinction to opposition levels. You know what I mean? If you look at it this way, how do you view where things have gone?
Well, I'm glad you started with our pollster friend, because, as you know, I don't love making premonitions or looking too much into polls, because the thing with them is they change. But there are probably some things we can draw from it at these early stages. I think that clearly there was an appetite amongst Canadians for change, and perhaps not necessarily for a strong shift rightwards. But if what Shachi's saying turns out to be the case, that it's mostly NDP supporters who are gravitating more towards the Liberals, I think people just feel potentially a little bit more confident that the Liberal Party has a strong shot at beating the Conservatives, and they want a strong alternative. They don't just want to see the the Conservatives march in with the very drastic changes that they're proposing to make. I think perhaps some other things that might play into better fortunes for the Liberals are the fact that there's a race going on, which will drum up a lot of interest amongst lots of people. I mean, you've seen them announce they're tripling their number of supporters, great fundraising numbers over the past few months. Clearly, there's an interest in a lot of people getting involved, and also people rallying behind the government in the way that it's handling the threat and the crisis that we're facing with a tariff war. Perhaps remembering as well how the government handled it the first time. So I'm not saying that these are things that I would draw from the numbers, but I think they're things that people may think about as they consider as we get closer and closer to an election.
Yeah, and look, Gary Cameron's right. Polling does change, and that's why we kind of waited until we saw a bunch of different pollsters in the field and seeing if there was any kind of consistency. And there seems to be, but to Shachi's point, it's still 40-41 for the Conservatives, which is a pretty good majority, no matter what. But the Liberals are getting back to where they're flirting with a number that begins with a 3, and they haven't seen that in a long time. What do you make of what we're seeing?
Yeah, and so looking at the suite of polls that are coming out, throw the ECOS poll out because, Frank Graves is pretty clear what he thinks of Mr. Poilievre. He's said in the past that he's going to make sure he doesn't, that he's never going to lead Canada and he doesn't make idle threats. So, I mean, Shachi can talk about the ethics of that kind of statement. Well, but look, when the Conservatives were at 45-47, who were they running against? They were, it was the poll question was, do you prefer a Conservative party led by Pierre Poilievre or a Liberal party led by Justin Trudeau? Of course, the reaction was extremely negative. Now, the Conservatives were never going to be at 45-47. I don't think Stephen Harper was at those numbers when in the middle of the coalition crisis back then. He was high, but I'm not sure he was even that high. So look, I think it's to be expected that when you have a leadership race especially for the governing party, people are going to be interested in that. And so, to Cameron's point too, the numbers absolutely do shift around. And so, but to the other point. One, if you're anywhere north of 40, you're still in a very comfortable position. And two, it is fascinating to watch the NDP numbers plummet, which then leads into a discussion about, well, maybe the NDP do want to do a deal with the Liberals, and the Liberals might say, no, we're good. Actually, we'll take our chances. So I think that question has some interest, and we'll see how things shake out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few steps between here and there, but there's nothing quite like a devastating election result to maybe focus the mind. But Andrew, I wonder about this. Like the Léger numbers, it shows a rebound in Quebec for the Liberals after losing La Salle-Marard, which obviously a very important power base for them. Do you take this, there's a realignment on the two so-called progressive parties here, more so than a potential realignment there? How do you view what we're seeing in the numbers?
There's certainly a change. I mean, you can feel it here in Ontario, too, that there's a change in mood, and it's all changed because of Donald Trump. And it's had some very interesting impacts. I mean, first of all, it's making Pierre Poilievre's, axe attack, sloganeering, seem a little bit like yesterday's man. I mean, what the conversation today is about something very different, much more existential for the country, for the country's economy, and the Conservatives haven't really figured out how to get on top of that. Secondly, I think the other thing that Trump has done is for left-wing voters, they're increasingly hearing Pierre Poilievre's message as Trumpian. And watching where Danielle Smith was, her traipsing back and forth to Mar-a-Lago, there's a lot of concern that, in fact, there's something more to what the conservative, the Pierre Poilievre conservatives are offering that seems much more American, much more pro-American, much more Trumpian. And I think that is a bat signal, which is causing leftist voters to think, where do you go to block that? So it changes now at the referendum. Previously, as we said, the referendum question was going to be Justin Trudeau. Increasingly, there's 2 or 3 questions. Who's best to manage the economy? Where is Pierre Poilievre at? What does he really believe? And then the question is, what is the the natural alignment in Ontario and Quebec, where your economic interests are? Which parties are going to best represent that?
So Gary, just to come back to you on that point, I wonder how the conservative universe views that, because Carney's who they focus on. It's gone from the Trudeau-Singh Liberals to the Trudeau-Carney Liberals. It's amazing how many coalition partners one prime minister can have. But the polling data would suggest that Carney is the preferred candidate, like the Quebec numbers suggest that. He's got more than half the caucus and cabinet, very likely to be him. He brings a pretty extensive and serious resume to a pretty complicated and serious time. So how do you calibrate dealing with a potential Liberal leader like that versus, a prime minister who would have been at the end of his life cycle in Justin Trudeau? Oh, 1 second, Gary. We got to get your mic open there. We got you muted. Either you did it or we did it, and if it was you, I'm not taking the blame for that. Go ahead, buddy.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? And that threw me off a bit.
Sorry, I got you. Just how do you, if you're the Conservatives and you see Carney getting some movement in the polls, how do you recalibrate knowing that you could be dealing with a guy with a pretty big resume in a pretty serious time, and that could be the number one preoccupation people are worried about?
Well, look, the Conservatives not shied away from trying to position Mark Carney. I mean, his track record speaks for itself. He's been Justin Trudeau's economic advisor. He supported a carbon tax in his various iterations all through it. And so when people say, oh, the Conservatives are panicking and this is a new approach, well, they haven't been paying attention because they've been going after and trying to position Mark Carney for a number of years. And you're right. The focus has been largely on Carney, partially in response to what the polls say about the Liberal leadership. But I think the Conservatives and I think Pierre Poilievre would love to take on Mark Carney in the next election and go after him, go after his previous record. You know, he claims to be an outsider, but this guy's getting confidential briefings from the cabinet. What about his ethics? He says he's, divested himself from a number of things, but he's still, we haven't seen anything from the ethics commissioner. We haven't seen any details about that. So I think, frankly, Mr. Poilievre relishes a chance to take on Mr. Carney after the Liberal leadership has come to an end.
Well, he's not elected and doesn't hold office, so I don't know if he has to comply with the ethics commissioner. I don't believe he would have to unless he actually wins the leadership race. But I mean, that will be something he has to do.
Look at his track record. He was the chairman of Brookfield, International. He is a private citizen. He is not elected to anything, and he is getting confidential briefings from the government of Canada on the trade tariffs. Is Chrystia Freeland getting that? Is Ruby Dahl getting that? Or Frank Baylis? I highly doubt it. So there are questions, I think, that have to be raised about the ethics of a private citizen who's never been elected to anything getting this type of access. And it's clear like Liberals, PMO and others seem to be in the bag for Mr. Carney.
Well, I wasn't dismissing your concerns about his financial holdings. I was just explaining to the audience that because he's not elected, there's no compliance he has to have with the ethics commissioner. What level of detail he's getting from which ministers is a very interesting question. I would agree with you because we've asked it too. But, Shachi, on the polling, Andrew says no, so I'll come back to him in a second. But Shachi, on the polling, like the volatility, is it all just Justin Trudeau is gone, now we'll look at this, or is there something about Carney, something about Freeland that opens up a broader universe of voters here?
It's something about Trump. That's the second part of this, and that is a big driver of where we're at the moment. It is the fact that for the first time in a really long time, you're seeing Canadians come together, aligned in public opinion on sort of this moment of pride in the country, this sort of defensive posture that Canadians are adopting, saying to Trump, saying to the White House, hey, you can't do that. You can't say that. I mean, maybe they can. That's a whole other panel.
Yeah, he'll try.
They'll try, and we'll try and mitigate and et cetera. But this crisis has really brought Canadians back together on issues of national unity, loosely using that phrase, in a way that we have not seen since the opening weeks and the first month or so of the pandemic 5 years ago. We have not seen a moment of unity, of alignment, of pride. And to go back to Andrew's point, that is what changes the ballot question.
Right.
The ballot question is no longer about axing the tax. It may be to a lesser extent if Poilievre can reframe about the record of the Liberals, but this crisis in a particular way has also leveled or reset the playing field in terms of what the key critical aspects of an upcoming election are going to be.
Right.
And why that is so important, I'll just say this, I know you want to go to Andrew, it's so important because as the Liberals get closer and start to narrow that gap, and they could potentially narrow it further, The room that Pierre Poilievre had to not talk about things, to not clarify his stance on things, to sometimes miss moments as he did with the Ukraine free trade vote, or not saying things about the Team Canada approach, or refusing to be read in on foreign interference. Those aren't things he's going to be able to skate on to the same extent.
Right. No, it's an interesting point. Andrew, you wanted to jump in there on the ethics point.
That was all actually much more articulate than what I was going to say, and much more insightful. So that was. But I think that does really frame the issue, and even for what Gary is saying, all of that could well be true, but I don't think that's where the electorate is focused right now. I'm watching here in Ontario. We've got a major provincial election on. The only conversation going on, much to the chagrin of both the NDP and the Liberals, is around the economy. And it is around the tariffs, and it is around Trump. And for all of the other sins that have been mentioned about where Doug Ford and the Conservatives have been, people are prepared to focus in on what is next and what is immediate. And that's very hard for the NDP or the Liberals to turn the conversation over to social programs and inequity and inequality. Right. And it's very hard for those who want to focus in on, ethical lapses and corruption.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's just what is being fundamentally reframed right now.
No, I would agree. And look, the carbon tax has always sort of been a substitute for affordability, sort of an effigy for it. And those issues are still going to be there in some form, no matter what, because that hasn't gone away. But Cameron, your last word, wrap us up before we take a quick break.
Quickly, I think there's nothing that impacts people's cost of living and questions about affordability more than a tariff war. And I think Shachi and Andrew have said it really well, very articulately. People understand, because we've been through this before. We spent 4 years dealing with a Trump White House who was threatening our economy on a very regular basis. You need a smart, strategic, thoughtful, unifying approach. And if all the Conservatives are going to offer is these shallow takes, as they have been through the past few years, it's not going to be enough. And I think people might see through that. Again, I'm not reading into that into the polls yet, but there is a chance that people come back to that feeling of, we need something smart. We need an approach that's actually thoughtful and actually going to get us through this. So far, the government's managed to handle the first round of this pretty well. We'll see what happens next.
We'll see what happens next is the anthem of our times.